Gul Dukat is perhaps the most well-rounded villain in Star Trek. The reason that Waltz likely ends as it does, with Sisko declaring that Gul Dukat is pure evil, not to mention the event that would occur at the end of the season that would lead to a cast change, it was because the writers and Marc Alaimo had done such a good job of bringing depth to the character that the pendulum had unwittingly swung too far in the other direction.
We cannot discuss the character of Dukat without examining the occupation, because it's simply an overshadowing issue for anybody who would have been in that position. How one chooses to wield near absolute authority is certainly a reflection upon their character. The occupation of Bajor was, from the Bajoran point of view, no doubt, the equivalent of many alien invasion stories that we see coming out of Hollywood, except the happy ending took 50 years to finally arrive. That should be noted because we need to understand it from their point of view as much as from Dukat's.
Dukat summed up the perspective, that they arrived as friends, but quickly noted that they were a century beyond the Bajorans, and so to them it was only logical that they dominate, that they didn't come to conquer, but it was merely the inevitable outcome of being in contact with so primitive of a planet.
In other words, the kind of ideas whose heinousness inspired the true purpose for the Prime Directive, and yet ironically would prevent the Federation from helping the Bajorans. The Cardassians' goals were to exploit that world's natural resources and to prepare it for full-scale colonization by their own people. Approximately 23 years before the start of DS9, Dukat was made Prefect of Bajor and head of the occupation. Dukat claims that he believed he could use a gentler hand with the Bajorans, and that the harshness was their own fault. They caused it to happen. They drove the situation to that. The arguments Dukat advances in his defense are that he ended child labor, improved medical care, reduced labor camp quotas, and increased food rations. Does that count for nothing? No, it's something. It definitely separates him from those like Gul Darheel who wanted to kill for killing's sake and all of that. But let's not forget, all these things don't change that he did not end slave labor and mass murder. What did not end was the occupation and rape of Bajor.
Now you might say that it's naive to suggest that Dukat should have ended those practices, that the Central Command would never let him. Sure. But the thing is, even if they wouldn't, it would never get that far, because Dukat wasn't trying to make the best of a bad situation. He wasn't a guilt-ridden man going into work day after day, faced with the sad burden of having to administrate an occupation that he didn't believe in, having to use methods that he didn't approve of. Dukat believed in the occupation. He believed the Cardassians were naturally superior and thus had a right to rule. In fact, he believed in it more than the people back home did. He opposed the withdrawal. So sure, he's not a Gul Darheel, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a bad person. The thing to remember about Dukat is his warped perspective, one that has always been present. For example, discussing when an attack took place that killed 200 Cardassians. So he rounded up 200 Bajorans and had them executed. 200 lives for 200 lives. That's justice, Dukat says. Except that, even if one accepted that as an idea of justice, unless 10 million Cardassians died during the occupation, that still wouldn't apply. But this is quite common. When something happens to the conqueror, it's justice when something is done to the conquered. But the deaths of the conquered can be ignored. There is no justice for them. To see that, recall when Damar executed Zial during the withdrawal, something that Dukat's sense of justice should say is right, that a member of the resistance that has caused numerous deaths has now likewise been killed. Your justice has been served, Dukat. And you don't take it very well, considering it was the moment when you succumbed to madness.
At no point at all does he associate this tragic personal loss with the losses of the Bajorans, millions of such deaths, and he takes no responsibility, shows no guilt. Now obviously anyone who loses a loved one in general, and a child in particular, is going to suffer greatly at that, and not have the same perspective. I'm not saying he should have looked up from her dying body with a revelation or anything, but even later on, as Sisko is pointing out what he did, At no time will Dukat associate the loss of Bajorans with the loss of his own, will not understand that the pain that drove him to madness and to the behavior of this episode was the same that drove them to rebellion. All of this is to show that Dukat's attitude is one of, for lack of a better word, destiny. He believes in the natural right of his people to rule, and yet also believes that one's own ambitions can carry them to power if they're prepared to do it. What upsets him are those who do not seem to know their place. Now, obviously no one can be summed up so simply, but it is one of the shapers of his outlook, and consequently his personality and choices. Yet he is not, again for a lack of a better term, inhuman. Dukat knows how to be charming, and I don't think that this was a false charm intended to manipulate. While I've said several times over the course of this that we don't know whether or not he means what he says, since he will lie if it suits his purpose, there have been several times when he could have helped earn the respect that he wanted from Sisko, Kira, the Bajorans, but he didn't. Dukat certainly wants it. I'd go so far as to say he yearns for it, from his lamentation that there were no statues to him on Bajor, to the exercise in waltz to get Sisko to admit to it. But still, he doesn't tell them what they want to hear. He wants to be respected for what he is. He wants to be vindicated in his actions, and he will not sell himself short to do it. With the withdrawal from Bajor, Dukat suffered a setback in his career, one he tried to recover from through various schemes to strengthen Cardassia or tear down his political enemies. This plan would often put him up against the DS9 crew, but by Season 3, when we got to Defiant, we started to see signs that he was softening to them a bit. Unlike with the Maquis, where it was yet another plot to elevate his career, it was simply dealing with a threat that wound up revealing much more about him. With his exchange with Sisko about his son and the patheticness of hatred for the Federation over the incident, we saw a different side to him. Why indeed would Dukat care if his son hated their enemies? Perhaps that ties in with the point that this episode had made, of Dukat's hatred for the Bajorans. Perhaps he decided that his indulgence in that emotion weakened him, that if he'd remained more cold-blooded about it, the occupation wouldn't have terminated. Or it could simply be that a father hates to see that kind of emotion in his son, no matter where it might be directed. We just don't know. Dukat's search to execute his daughter and eventual refusal to carry it out both show his cold-bloodedness, and yet his, again lacking a better term, humanity. For a man of ambition, there was only one logical thing to do. But in the end, he showed that he was more than that there were some things worth ruining his career and trampling his pride over. And as we saw in Return to Grace, that's a lot of pride to bruise. Yet within this episode, we see his return to power and facing the harsh reality of the situation now that this new civilian government was in place and the war was on, the lack of stomach to continue the fight. This is why he rants so, believing himself to be the only Cardassian left because only he is prepared to fight. The Cardassians dominated the Bajorans because they were stronger. They had the might, so they had the right. With the Klingons pounding them and the Cardassians willing to sue for peace, it proved the Klingons were the stronger, that the Klingons deserved to dominate them in the same way. And that was a thought Dukat could not stomach. It was an attack on the very core of what it meant to be Cardassian, to roll over, especially when those weak, inferior Bajorans were willing to fight on. No, this must not be permitted to continue. This must be stopped by any means necessary. Dukat's move to work with the Dominion shows where that had led. If the Cardassians had forgotten what had made them great, then he would step in and make them embrace greatness. As part of the Dominion, they would again be respected and feared. And really, what was the alternative? The Klingons? In that light, it makes sense to choose voluntarily to join a greater power than being crushed by one, by having the choice and an arrangement that made Cardassia strong, with him at the center of power. It was hard to see a downside in any of that. And yet with Ziyal, we see him leaving her to die because, as he said, refusing to go with him was a betrayal. In the order of things, it was the job of Cardassian families to respect their elders, so it really hampered his vision of himself as true Cardassian when he's lost his family over this girl and now she too abandons him. Now, to be fair, the family abandoned him because he was publicly shown not to be Cardassian, by being indiscreet with the Bajoran women, which might explain part of his reason to kill her in the first place, that she was not just a threat, she was a symbol of his fallibility he didn't like knowing was out there. Yet Dukat isn't all about power issues. His affection for Zial is genuine, even if some of the things he said to win her approval seem like they were stretching things. Comments about the occupation being a mistake don't seem to agree with other comments he's made later on, just to pick one example. And his view of Sisko and Kira, while fundamentally warped, nevertheless grew from a respect for them, a sign perhaps that he saw worthy adversaries. And so it was reasonable in his mind that they would feel the same about him. After all, why wouldn't they? Sure, they were adversaries, but there's no need to take that fact personally, right? Isn't the Federation especially supposed to be forgive and forget? If Dukat chooses to now be their ally, whether it's with the Maquis or against the Rogue Defiant or what have you, doesn't the Federation Code say that Sisko should welcome him and leave all those past conflicts behind them? They're friends with those smelly barbaric Klingons, right? Surely they'll be friends with him if they'll be friends with them, huh? But no, the Federation disapproved of Cardassian methods, which was clearly jealousy on their part, since Cardassian methods ensured that the guilty could not escape, that its citizenry would achieve great heights, and that their values that they held sacred would be preserved. The Federation, at least to him, was just a bunch of save-the-whale softies who like to talk a good game, but in the end were big on the talk, short on the action. Yeah, they hemmed and they hawed over his crimes during the occupation, about the injustice of everything, but when the Klingons chose to invade Cardassia, they just stood on the sidelines going, "Hey man, you are on a path to negative karma. Let go of the whole warrior identity and find love. We are all one with the galaxy, man." Yep, it wasn't until the Federation itself was threatened that they chose to directly step in. Up until then, it was all just behind-the-scenes stuff. Oh, let's just talk in front of the Cardassian here and let the information, and we can maintain our plausible deniability, because God forbid we should actually stand up for the things we claim to value. No. Yeah, as far as Dukat was concerned, it revealed that the Federation is just a collection of complacent and judgmental wieners. If they want to pass judgment, let them. That's about all they're good for anyway. So from his point of view, he was the good guy, and it was the Federation that had the problem. And that's not an unreasonable attitude. Dukat's views of the occupation may be warped, but his views of the Federation are just his interpretation of the evidence, and to him, they are wanting. Part of what makes a well-rounded villain, or antagonist if you feel that villain is too harsh, is that their behavior should show basically normal people who just happen to be on the wrong side, and Dukat succeeds at that very well. He demonstrated admirable traits, courtesy, patriotism, respect, resolve, and the aforementioned charm, but without using it for deceit. It's understandable that this might make things swing too far in the other direction, because while he was aligned with the good guys, as discussed over the story arc, his loyalty is not to them. Now that's not villainous, let me be clear on that. But what it shows is that Dukat's so-called redemption was nothing of the sort. I don't believe that the Dukat we see anywhere along the line, from emissary to sacrifice of angels, was a different man. That the one who ran the occupation was just as capable of showing mercy to his daughter. That the one who tried seducing Kira was just as likely to order the deaths of Bajorans and call it justice. You might think I'm being disingenuous to deny that Dukat was redeemed, but I prefer to think of it as rather a period of revelation. We had witnessed or heard about the bad he was capable of, but this was the time when we saw the good. In other words, Dukat never changed. All that happened was that we got to see more of the real man, the angelic as well as the demonic, that were both always there. Waltz brought all that to a head with what was essentially the trial of Dukat. I mean, that is what the episode opened up with, talking about the fact that Dukat was going to go on trial. What it didn't reveal was the trial was going to be held essentially in that cave, and the judge and jury would be the audience. Both sides laid out their reasons, and the issues were finally resolved. This came at just the right time, just a few episodes after the end of the Dominion War arc. He had traveled a complicated path, attained his greatest height, and then fell. The big mistake of Waltz was that, in the end, he lived. His story had completely played out. His death now was the natural conclusion. It would have allowed him, fully revealed, to exit the show with a kind of gravitas and complexity worthy of the character. Instead, Dukat escaped to return as a mixed-bag baddie with little connection to his previous role. It winds up feeling like a villain who has lost all relevancy, but the writers were desperate to make him one. It'd be like following up the death of the Green Goblin from Spider-Man, when all the narrative events bring it to this natural end, Suddenly he's alive and he's got a robot arm and a thirst for human blood. It's an embarrassing and artificial point tacked on solely to try to keep him alive past the point when he should have departed. But regardless, Dukat still stands up as one of the classic villains of Star Trek, a rare one capable of as much good as evil, as much compassion as cruelty. Perhaps the reason he lived was simply that no one could bother letting such a character go, which is a testament to a well-rounded and loved character.